Hello, my name is Mage and welcome to Black and White Thinking. Today's video was not planned or even scripted. It's another one of those little rants where I need to say something and I'm going to get it off my chest because I feel like it will haunt me if I don't. Today I want to talk a little bit about the ever-long fight for trans rights in the United Kingdom, where I live, and how the biggest source for news in this country, the BBC, is sabotaging any hope we have of having a reasonable conversation around trans rights, prison reform, and protections for women and girls. For those of you that aren't in the know, 2 weeks ago, and ironically I wasn't even in the UK when this happened, I was with a friend because they were having gender-affirming surgery. You really can't make this up. 2 weeks ago in the UK, Scotland, which is one of the 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom, voted through Parliament a bill that essentially meant that you could apply to change your gender recognition legally in about 3 months, rather than the average 2 years it usually takes. This means that if you're trans, you can apply for a little license that says, I am a woman or I am a man, and you can use it to take to your doctor and change some forms. It's really not that big of a deal and should not really involve anyone but trans people. It is not, and we'll talk about this a little bit, some sort of card that instantly changes your sex overnight and stops you being trans. For obvious reasons, if you've ever met or spoken to a trans person, you could probably understand how this change could be really helpful for them. However, after being passed through Scottish Government by a majority, the bill has been rolled back by the government in London. And in order to kind of understand how and why this happened, you kind of need to know the bureaucracies of how the UK is made up. So the UK, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland all technically are one country, whilst all being separate countries at the same time. We have one major government in London, the British government, that overlooks governments in the other countries. These governments, let's take the Scottish one for example, because that's what we're going to be talking about, have the right to enact their own bills and their own laws. But they also have the right to be knocked down by the English government if the English government does not agree with their bills. Now, I am proud to say I never voted for Brexit. I voted to remain, and I will never not be angry about the fact that we left the EU. Scotland, the country, and the Scottish people as a whole voted to remain. That's an entire country that voted to stay in the EU. But because there are more people in England, they were outvoted en masse and forced to leave the EU alongside England, even though the majority of Scottish citizens, and if you know anything about English and Scottish people, we're different countries, we're not the same, and England spent a good portion of its time trying to colonise Scotland. It has colonised Scotland. They were forced to leave the EU because English people decided for them. A similar thing happened last week. Holyrood, the government in Scotland, voted to make the lives of trans people easier, and the English government, not the citizens, decided that that was, quote, dangerous.
Just weeks after the Scottish Parliament voted overwhelmingly to pass the Gender Reform Act, the UK government is legally trying to block it.
Part of the reason that they claimed it was dangerous was because Scotland voted to lower the required age to apply for a gender recognition certificate from 18 to 16. Now, this was played off as a, will somebody please think of the children moment, as if 16-year-olds are not capable of making their own choices, which is absolutely fucking ridiculous. There's no other way to frame it. From the age of 16 in the UK, you can do a lot of things. You can open a bank account, you can give consent and have sex, you can work a full-time job, you can get married. You will be prosecuted if you sleep with someone under 16, so you're not considered a child in those cases. You can change your name legally. If you are caught doing a crime at 16, you will be convicted of a criminal offence and you can be sent to prison. And you will be remanded in custody to await trial in that case. You are not considered a minor. At 15 even, that applies. There are lots of things you can do at 16 in the UK. You can live by yourself. Your parents are legally allowed to kick you out of the house the day you turn 16. But if you're trans, you're not allowed to identify the way in which you wish. You're allowed to change your name, and if you're cis, you're allowed to change your name, but you are not allowed to ask people to recognise your gender. which is just an absolute logical fallacy and stupid as hell. Another reason people are claiming to be upset by Scotland's decision to let trans children, trans young people live their fucking life is that they worry the shortening of waiting time for gender recognition certificates will encourage male prisoners to change their gender in order to prey on women in female prisons. And my God, has this conversation kicked off in the British media.
In the last few years, trans people in Britain have faced an increasing hostility from the British press and a series of court cases and government decisions which have threatened their rights in law.
Now, the British media is fucking trash. Everyone knows it. It's famous for being terrible. It does very little good for anyone and is the OG rage baiter when it comes to headlines. The BBC have been covering a few specific issues recently because of the passing of the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland and the shooting down of it in England. The BBC is a big company, but BBC News specifically has never been great with its trans reporting. I would actually say it's transphobic. I'm not the only person to think that. I've watched many people cover this topic before. I highly recommend checking out Verity's video on an article that BBC published last year about how trans women are preying on lesbians. That was fun. I would also recommend watching Abigail's video over at PhilosophyTube that she recently did on the state of the NHS. As someone that is not trans but chronically ill and has to deal with the NHS on a weekly basis, it was incredibly helpful, and she covered a lot of things that I just do not have the energy to cover as a sick person on a day-to-day basis. But she uses herself and trans healthcare in that video as an example, and for those that don't know, I live on Turf Island. England, specifically right now, is going through a particularly transphobic stage, and not the people. Not the citizens on a day-to-day basis. I can't remember the last time I had an actual conversation with a transphobe that wasn't on the internet, but given that the most famous author to come out of England in the last 3 decades has decided to make it her personal mission to call all trans people rapists on Twitter, it's in the zeitgeist. It's unignorable. The BBC BBC News have particularly pissed me off with this though. They are currently trying to look for any story they can report on to prove that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister for Scotland's pushing through of this GRA bill, the Gender Recognition Act. They're looking for any excuse to show her how wrong she is and how dangerous trans people actually are.
And there are some people that I think have decided to use women's rights as a sort of cloak of acceptability to cover what is transphobia.
And it's kind of scary. I might be cis, but I am queer as fuck, and some of my favourite people on the entire planet are trans. I will die for them, and I will not let this occur. Like, it's that simple. Cis gays, cis bis, cis lesbians, whatever you want to identify as, we need to stand up to this, because it's very Section 28. If you don't know what Section 28 is, it's a law that was brought in by Margaret Thatcher, may she rot in peace, that basically prevented school children being taught about LGBT issues in any way. It was a law that lasted while I was still at school. So as a queer child growing up in the UK, I was purposely shielded by the government from learning about people such as myself. And so were my queer siblings, of which most of my siblings are. We're an incredibly gay family. And this effect is immeasurable. It's really messed up. Any queer person from about the age of 50 to 25 in the UK.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
It had a lasting effect on how safe queer people felt growing up in this country. It also meant that things like my gay teachers were never allowed to tell me they were gay, which is crazy because I had a lot of gay teachers and they were my favourite teachers and they looked after me in a way that other people didn't, because obviously they knew something I didn't, but they were never allowed to confirm why. It was a homophobic bill, and this bill is much the same. Or at least the shooting down of this bill is much the same. The bill itself is actually great. Okay, now that rant's out of the way, I'm really sorry this is unscripted, so you will just hear me going off track every 5 minutes. I want to specifically talk about one BBC article I read, because god damn it did it make me angry. Furious. Fuming. It wound me up, and it still wounds me up. And I wasn't going to make a video about this, or if I was going to, sit and script it and make a proper video about this, but I just can't stop thinking about this article. And it's one of many. Hopefully I can show you what I mean. Hopefully me that is recording this has made me that's editing this's life easier, and I will be able to show you the article I'm talking about and show you the BBC website. So on the BBC website, they have a nice little search bar. This is the BBC News website, and you can search anything you want. So I've searched the word trans to just see what coverage we've got, and here we have it. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 articles on the front page if you search trans, all about one singular issue that is occurring in Scotland now that involves 2 women. The transphobia in the media at the moment is so explicit that because Nicola Sturgeon dared to say trans people should be allowed to identify how they wish, even at 16, the BBC has, like I said, gone out of its way to look for anything that says otherwise. And they have honed in on the stupidest of stories in order to prove that trans people do not deserve rights. In Scotland, currently, if you are a trans prisoner, you are dealt with by what we call a case-by-case basis. There are not many trans prisoners in Scotland, or even in the UK. Trans people actually have an incredibly low rate of criminality. Trans people are generally not a threat. According to a 2022 study, trans people make up 0.2% of the total population in Scotland. At last count, there were 4 trans men in prison in Scotland and 11 trans women, which is 15 people. 15 people in the entirety of Scotland, which has a population of millions. Now, let's get to the article I actually brought you all here for. So, meet Isla Bryson. She's a twat, a rapist, and a complete piece of trash. Nobody, cis or trans, is here to defend Isla. She was recently convicted of rape, and she's going to prison for it. I think we can all agree that that is a good thing for women's rights, when rapists of women are put in prison. However, when Isla committed her rapes, she identified as a man. Whilst she has been awaiting trial, Isla has come out as a trans woman, which, again, I'm really not sure what it has to do with any of this. She's a rapist, she goes to prison. Does it really matter what prison she goes to? Apparently it does. And this is where the bullshit reporting from BBC comes into play. So for me it just says 3 fucking days ago, whatever. So on the 27th of January this year, 2023, 3 days ago of me recording this, the BBC published an article discussing Isla's case. And as I said, in Scotland and in the UK generally, I believe, trans prisoners are usually put in prison originally based on their sex, and then from there they can apply to be rehoused via their gender. Recently, the consideration of the difference between gender and sex has been happening before they go into prison. It's dealt with on a case-by-case basis because there are not many trans people in prison. It's something that the British government can and should afford. It's really not that hard to understand why trans prisoners should deserve a little bit more respect when it comes to housing them in a safe place. Now, I'm not talking about Isla specifically here, but trans women are far more likely to be victims of rape than they are rapists. Isla here might like to buck the trend, but she is not the majority. She is not the blueprint for the trans experience in prison. Now, Isla's case was reviewed, and after days of the BBC talking about how a trans rapist was going to be put in with the poor cis women, she wasn't, and that's it. That's the end of the story. However, the BBC have continued to report it, and once Isla's case was dealt with, they simply moved on to the next trans person and started reporting on their case as well. in this specific article on BBC, they discuss this case with a woman called Rona Hotchkiss, who ran the prison, the female prison that Isla might have gone to if her case had been won, which it wasn't. It was deemed that she would not be housed amongst female prisoners for safety reasons. Pretty simple, clear-cut story that nobody really needs to know about. In this article, it's very much framed as a woman's rights issue and a prisoner's rights issue, ignoring the obvious fact that trans women's issues intersect with both of those things. The BBC, and specifically Rona Hotchkiss, do not care about prisoners' rights. They don't care about prison reform. They definitely don't care about queer women in prison. Many women in prison in the UK, in the US, and I imagine in most of the fucking world, are queer. A ridiculously large and overproportionate amount of prisoners identify as bisexual, actually. Prison is bad, even if you think people should be there. Prisoners deserve rights, even if they've trampled over the rights of other people. It's something we have to accept if we want to live in a healthy society, right? Even child molesters get 3 meals a day and a shower, and they should. It's, again, just something we have to accept if we are going to live in a healthy, safe society for all of us. It's the only way forward. Rona Hotchkiss, who the BBC interviewed first for this, because they interview a few people, well, they quote a few people in this article right at the end who disagree with Miss Hotchkiss, but they didn't interview them, they simply grabbed some quotes. Whereas Rona Hotchkiss was interviewed and filmed, put on BBC News, the live station. She was allowed to talk about it. Now, Rona Hotchkiss is a transphobic lesbian. It's that simple. She is a TERF. She is also a prison officer. As I said, she ran the prison, Corton Vale, in Scotland for women until 2017, and she is a terrible person. Hi, editing mage here. Sorry for the noise. It's not going to be the usual quiet. I just realised that Rona Hotchkiss, the woman I'm bitching about in this video, is on the board of directors of J.K. Rowling's so-called Women's Centre that purposely excludes trans women. So, make of that what you will. She does not care about women being raped or tortured or abused. And I know that for a fact, because one, she is a member of the LGB Alliance. The LGB Alliance is a hate group in the UK.
The LGB Alliance had a stall at this week's Conservative Party conference. It's the second year in a row that the campaign group has been at the conference.
That purposely tries to advocate for queer rights that do not involve trans people. They'll probably hate me for daring to call themselves queer. They are lesbian, gay and bisexual, except they have mostly lesbian and straight members, and they actively campaign against their own rights, constantly. They are all friends with J.K. Rowling. That's the kind of group they are. Nasty, terrible, and not necessary in 2023. I can't think of any reasonable member of the L, G or B communities that would purposely advocate for the eradication of trans people and not think that they were next on the list. That's some George Santos levels of logic. But Rona Hotchkiss, the piece of crap that they interviewed for this article, who said she would have quit her job if she had had to deal with Isla and this situation, was actually reported on by the European Committee on the Prevention of Torture when they visited the prison when she was running it. Corton Vale, the female prison in Scotland, was given a scathing, and that is a direct quote, report from the European Committee on the Prevention of Torture after the committee visited Corton Vale. And that has nothing to do with trans prisoners. I'm actually going to quote a woman, Sarah Armstrong, who is a professor of criminology at Glasgow University. She says it better than I ever could. We hear the committee, the European Committee of the Prevention of Torture, once again, saying that women are being held for segregation for such long periods at Corton Vale with no mental health support that one woman gnawed her arm to the bone. I'd love to hear those who care about the safety of women showing up for the issues that are really facing women in prisons. And fuck me, Sarah, do I agree. It is amazing that the BBC are reporting on this as a prisoners' rights issue when they do not give two shits about women in prison. Women in prison who are almost always poor and mostly queer. Prisons that are being run so badly that they are being pulled up by the European Committee on the Prevention of Torture. The same committee that you will find in war zones. And the BBC is just interviewing this woman like her opinion matters, like she cares about women. And she's genuinely saying that. Here is a quote from Ms. Hotchkiss. "It's unbalancing rights. They are not considering the rights of women. They are only considering one side of this equation. It seems to me quite wrong." Do you know what's quite wrong? A woman gnawing her arm to the bone because she's crazy and you left her in segregation, Hotchkiss. That is way more dangerous than one woman, Isla, having her case considered by a panel and then having it rejected. And Miss Hotchkiss is not a reasonable person. She is a transphobe. Not only for being part of the LGB alliance, but also just for the shit that she says in this article. Another quote. "Well, if you can get a gender recognition certificate within 3 months instead of the current 2 years, lots of male prisoners will do it. Citation needed." Where is she getting this information from? I don't think this woman has ever actually spoken to a trans person, and I find it ridiculous that trans men are completely ignored in this conversation, as if they just don't exist. The idea that trans people just means middle-aged male rapist in dress is so transphobic and so reminiscent of the homophobia that we have been fighting in this country for decades. One of the reasons my gay teachers were not allowed to tell me they were gay was because it was considered to be child abuse. It was assumed that all gay people were simply predators, and that is exactly what is happening here. Miss Hotchkiss said it was simply not acceptable to allow all trans prisoners to go to a jail matching their gender identity. They're fucking not. That is literally what this article discusses, and that is literally what has happened over the last few days. Isla, being a rapist, was considered unsafe to house with other women, so she wasn't housed with other women. And yet, they're still spouting this complete bullshit, as if it's just fact. It also completely negates the idea that women are abusive. Like, I'm a feminist and I know how the world works. No one's saying that men aren't worse. They are, generally. That's just fact. But women are perfectly capable of being awful and criminal. And how many of the 300 female prisoners in Scotland that there are, how many of them do you think are safe around women, even if they are women? There is no way that some of those women are not rapists themselves. And cis. This is an issue about how we house prisoners that are potentially dangerous to other prisoners. And no one cares when it's men. No one cares when a man is put in prison for drug crimes with rapists and murderers, and then he is raped in prison. On this channel, I've talked about Donnie the Punk many times. He's one of my favourite bi icons. He did so much for our community, and he died way too young. And he died of AIDS. He died of HIV, which turned into AIDS. He died of AIDS because he was raped in prison, where he was being held on charges for protesting. In this article, they discuss and bounce the idea around that maybe we should have a third prison for trans people, as if trans people are their own gender. Stupid for a million reasons, but the biggest reason is that that doesn't protect anyone from rapists. If you want a third prison, maybe, and this is just me being fucking stupid, maybe have a prison that is specifically for predators. Because the issue here, really, is that we house non-violent criminals with violent criminals. It is not that we put trans people in prison with cis people. No one in their right mind in this country thinks that rapists should just be allowed in general population. But that is the only issue here. It is not an issue of trans versus cis. It is simply an issue of predator versus prey. It is an issue about prison reform and prisoner rights that people deserve regardless of whether they are trans or cis. And this country is losing their fucking mind over it, for no reason. I mean, seriously, has anyone been on Joanne's Twitter recently? It's a fucking mess. People are using this one case to just call all trans women rapists and to completely erase the existence of trans men. And no, that's pretty much all I have to say. Just no. As I said earlier in this video, some of my favourite people are trans, and they are allowed to exist. They are allowed to exist safely. They are not rapists simply because they identify as trans, and they are not potential predators in waiting. On the screen, you will see a video of me as a child, and next to me is my sibling. I asked them what I should call them in this video, their real name or their nickname, and they replied with, well, I'm not going to tell you actually, but it was funny. My sibling's funny. They are always the funniest person in the room. It used to really annoy me actually as a child. All my friends liked them more just because they were so fucking hilarious, and they would walk into any room and draw all of the attention towards themselves, and not in some weird narcissistic way, but in a being the life of the party way. They were fascinating and hilarious, and people like that. They also happen to be trans. They are one of my favourite people on the planet, and I do not know what I would do if I ever had to do life without them. They are the person that I have to tell anything important to. They encourage me, they care about me. We've almost killed each other many times, and I wouldn't change it for the world. We shared a room until I was 18 years old, and the bond that we have is definitely abrasive at times, but it is a bond that I have with no one else on this planet. We are pretty close in age, and our lives are parallel. We are intertwined in a way that I feel like if you have a sibling that is close to your age, you will probably understand. It was us against the world. Wrong or right, we always had each other's backs, and we will always have each other's backs. As a giant fuck you to J.K. Rowling, and in order to direct my anger into a healthier space, I'm going to use this opportunity to advertise my sibling, Neve. I'm going to use this opportunity to advertise their GoFundMe. My sibling is currently trying to save money and raise money in order to get top surgery. I, as the older sibling, wish we didn't have to beg. I wish I could just pay for it tomorrow, make them happy and healthy in a way that I know they will be once they have this surgery. But I'm poor, so I can't do that. But I can do this. So, my sibling, who I love very much, even if that sounds gay as hell, they're going to be listening to this and laughing at me, needs help in order to get the surgery that will keep them alive. And if they're alive, I'm alive. So, if ever any of you have ever considered supporting this channel in a monetary way, and I am no pressure here, guys, I'm just using my opportunity, taking it, please don't judge me. If you've ever wanted to send me a couple of bucks, send them to my sibling instead. This is really important to me, and any money I get from YouTube I'm probably going to be siphoning towards this fund anyway. I'm going to show you what it looks like on screen, but I will also link it below. And like I said, if you have a spare dollar tonight, a spare quid, a spare couple of kronas, please consider helping my sibling get the care they need and will not get under the NHS right now because of the transphobia this country is so deeply entrenched in right now. Like I said, check out Abigail Thorne's video on the NHS and trans healthcare if you want more details on how hard it is to get trans healthcare in a socialised system that is falling apart. I don't think anyone in our family has ever had to seek private healthcare for anything, but this is going to have to be a case of doing that because of how badly this country is run and how much institutionally we despise queer happiness. Anyway, this has been a rant. I've been Mage, and this was Black and White Thinking. Catch you in the next scripted, already half made, but I needed to get this off my chest, video. Peace. Stay safe.